Lisa McCormick stood on the edge of a high-altitude crane platform, the freezing wind of the steel mill whipping the smoke from a flare gun across her face. Below her, the local police sergeant was methodically pouring gasoline onto the only exit stairs, a predatory grin cutting through the darkness. In her trembling hand, Lisa clutched a leather-bound ledger, a book that proved the law was the muscle, and her husband was the monster. Just moments ago, she had discovered the blood on Tom's knuckles wasn't from a fight to save their family, but the price of a secret life she never knew existed. As the first match flickered and dropped toward the fuel, Lisa realized she was trapped between a burning floor and a 100-foot drop. She looked down at the ledger, where her own husband's handwriting ended and the sergeant's began, documenting the systematic destruction of their entire neighborhood. She had no allies, her car's brakes had been cut, and the man she spent 15 years with had just sold her soul to cover a gambling debt. The fire roared to life, climbing the steel rungs toward her, leaving her with one impossible question. How do you survive a war when the people sworn to protect you are the ones holding the torch? The torch hissed, a blue-white tongue licking the seam of steel. Lisa McCormick's fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon's, the weld bead forming smooth and clean under her control. The factory hummed around her, metal groaning under pressure, the rhythmic clank of conveyor belts, the distant shout of a foreman. Sweat beaded at her hairline, trickling down her temple, but she didn't wipe it. One wrong flick of the wrist, and the whole joint would be ruined. Her mind wasn't on the weld. It was on the stack of bills on the kitchen table, the red-stamped final notice glaring up at her like an accusation. The numbers blurred when she tried to add them, but the total was always the same. Too much. The bank had called again that morning, the voice on the other end polite but firm, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "We understand your situation, Ms. McCormick, but we need a payment plan by Friday." The arc was the only thing that made sense anymore. In that tiny circle of blinding light, she was in control. Outside of it, Gary was swallowing her whole. The smell of ozone and burnt metal filled her lungs, a scent she'd carried home in her hair for 15 years, just like her mother had. She could feel the vibration of the heavy machinery through the soles of her boots, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to match the anxious racing of her heart. Every inch of steel she joined was a few cents toward a mortgage that felt like a tombstone. She adjusted her grip, the leather of her gloves stiff with age, and focused on the pool of molten metal. It was a delicate dance of heat and pressure, a balance she was failing to maintain in every other aspect of her life. A shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. She turned just as the brick shattered the office window. Glass exploded inward, a glittering storm of shards raining onto her desk. The torch slipped from her grip, clattering to the floor, its flames sputtering out. Her breath hitched, fingers curling into fists within her heavy gloves. Outside, a car engine roared, tires screeching against pavement in a jagged, violent rhythm. The sound echoed through the cavernous warehouse, momentarily silencing the rhythmic thud of the stamp presses. Lisa stood frozen, the sudden silence of her own station ringing louder than the industrial cacophony. "Lisa!" The foreman's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. "You okay?" She didn't answer. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she stared at the brick, now resting among the scattered papers on her desk. A single word was scrawled in black marker across its surface. "Pay up." The jagged edges of the broken window looked like teeth, biting into the gray Indiana sky. Cold air rushed in, smelling of rain and diesel, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the welding floor. She didn't need to read the note to know who sent it. The weight of the world, which had been pressing against her chest for months, suddenly became a sharp, physical point of impact. The factory noise faded into a dull throb. All she could hear was the blood rushing in her skull, the sharp tang of burnt metal still clinging to the air. Her hands trembled, not from the shock of the brick, but from the weight of what it meant. They knew where she worked. They knew she was running out of time. She looked at her hands, the thick-knuckled, scarred fingers that were the only tools she had to build a life for Emily. She felt a cold, hard knot of anger beginning to form beneath the fear. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was an invasion. When the whistle finally blew, signaling the end of a grueling shift, Lisa didn't join the usual exodus of weary workers heading for the local tavern. She moved like a ghost through the locker room, scrubbing the grease from her face with industrial soap that smelled like lye. The walk to her car was a gauntlet of shadows. Every flickering streetlight in the parking lot felt like a spotlight. Every distant engine revving sounded like a threat. She drove through the cracked streets of Gary, passing the boarded-up storefronts and the skeletal remains of the old mills, her eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. The house was silent when she entered, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. The moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating the kitchen table. There they were, the paper ghosts of her failures. Electricity shut-off warnings, medical bills for Emily's lungs, and the mortgage statement that looked more like a ransom note. She sat down, the chair creaking under her weight, and pressed her palms to her eyes until she saw stars. The air in the house was stale, smelling of old wood and the lingering scent of Tom's absence. She wasn't a woman who prayed, but she found herself whispering apologies to the empty room. Apologies to Emily for the shoes with the holes in the soles, apologies to her mother for ending up exactly where she'd promised she wouldn't. The isolation was a physical weight. Tom was supposed to be the partner, the one who shared the load, but lately, he was just another ghost in the machine. She stood up, her joints aching, and headed toward the garage. Something wasn't right. The way Tom had been acting, the late nights, the sudden influx of cash, followed by weeks of nothing. It all pointed to a basement she hadn't wanted to look into. The garage was cold, the concrete floor leaching the warmth from her feet. It smelled of motor oil and secrets. She began to search, not with the frantic energy of a panicked woman, but with the methodical precision of a welder looking for a crack in a seam. She moved the heavy stacks of tires, shifted the rusted cans of paint, and finally reached for Tom's heavy-duty toolbox. It was a massive, scarred thing, locked with a heavy padlock. She knew where the key was, hidden inside a hollowed-out spark plug on the workbench. Her fingers trembled as she turned the key. The lock clicked open with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet garage. She lifted the lid, expecting to find tools, but instead, she found a weathered, leather-bound ledger. It was tucked beneath a false bottom, hidden away with a desperation that made her stomach churn. She pulled it out, the leather cool and smooth against her calloused palms. This was it, the source of the rot. She sat on a milk crate, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. As she flipped through the pages, the reality of their life began to unravel. This wasn't a work log. It was a record of misery, page after page of names. Neighbors she saw at the grocery store, men she worked with at the factory, all listed alongside astronomical interest rates and dates of collection. It was a predatory loan ledger, a map of the debt that was strangling their community. And there, in the margins, were Tom's notes. Chilling clinical observations about who was ready to break and who needed a reminder. The names were a roll call of the desperate. Old Mr. Henderson from down the street, who'd lost his pension when the plastics plant closed. Sarah, the waitress at the diner, who was trying to put her son through community college. Each entry was a life being bled dry, and her husband was the one holding the needle. Lisa felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't just married to a man who was failing, she was married to a man who was profiting from the failure of everyone around them. The ledger was a confession, written in the cramped, hurried hand of a man who knew he was drowning. The sound of a truck pulling into the driveway shattered her focus. She shoved the ledger back into the toolbox, locked it, and replaced the spark plug just as the side door groaned open. Tom walked in, the smell of cheap whiskey and sweat trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. He didn't see her at first. He moved to the workbench, his shoulders slumped, his movements heavy and uncoordinated. When he turned and saw her standing in the shadows, he jumped, a sharp, jagged motion that spoke of a guilty conscience. "Lisa, what are you doing out here?" His voice was thick, slurred. She didn't answer. She looked at his hands. His knuckles were split and swollen, stained with dried blood that wasn't his own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, tossing it onto the workbench like it was trash. "Got the mortgage covered?" he muttered, not looking her in the eye. "Told you I'd handle it." The sight of the money, blood money, she realized now, made her skin crawl. The heroic provider act was a lie, a thin veneer over a core of violence. She looked at the man she'd spent 15 years with and saw a stranger, a predator. The tension in the garage was thick enough to choke on, the air vibrating with the things they weren't saying. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away, the movement instinctive and sharp. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a low growl. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of another car pulling up outside. Not the familiar rattle of a neighbor's sedan, but the smooth, predatory hum of a high-end engine. Lisa moved to the window, peering through the grime. A man stepped out of a black SUV. He was a mountain of a man, his bald head gleaming under the flickering streetlight. Miller. She recognized him from the factory, not as a worker, but as the shadow that haunted the gates on payday. He didn't knock. He walked straight to the garage door and kicked it, the metal booming like a drum. "McCormick, I know you're in there. We need to talk about the book." Tom went pale, his bloodshot eyes darting around the garage like a trapped animal's. "Lisa, go inside," he hissed, his voice cracking. "Now." But Lisa didn't move. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She watched as Miller shoved his way into the garage, his presence filling the small space, making the air feel thin. He didn't look at Tom. He looked at Lisa, his eyes cold and calculating, like he was weighing her worth in scrap metal. "The ledger, lady," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "Give it to me, and maybe your husband keeps his teeth." Lisa felt the weight of her heavy tool bag hanging from her shoulder. It was filled with the instruments of her trade, wrenches, hammers, the heavy steel components of her welding kit. She didn't think. She acted. As Miller stepped toward her, his hand reaching out in a dismissive gesture, she swung the bag with every ounce of strength she had left. The heavy canvas hit him square in the ribs with a sickening thud. Miller let out a sharp wheeze, his face contorting in pain as he stumbled back against the workbench, sending tools clattering to the floor. He looked at her with a mix of shock and budding fury. But the surprise gave her the second she needed. "Get out," she rasped, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. "Get off my property before I show you what else is in this bag." Miller clutched his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Tom, who was frozen in a corner, then back at Lisa. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face, one that didn't reach his eyes. You got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit don't pay the vig. You just made this a whole lot harder on yourself, Mrs. McCormick. He turned and limped back to his car, the gravel crunching under his boots like breaking bone. Lisa stood in the driveway, the heavy bag still clutched in her hand, watching the red taillights of the SUV disappear into the Gary night. The surge of victory was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by a cold, hollow dread. She had struck a blow, but she knew it was only the beginning. Miller wouldn't go away. He'd come back with friends, with guns, with the weight of the syndicate behind him. She turned to look at Tom, who was still standing by the workbench, his face buried in his hands. "What did you do, Tom?" she asked, the words coming out as a tired sigh. He didn't look up. "I was trying to save us, Lisa. The surgery, Emily's lungs, the insurance wouldn't cover it. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," she snapped, the anger finally bubbling over. "You chose to bleed our neighbors. You chose to work for monsters." She went back inside, leaving him in the dark of the garage. She needed to know the full extent of the damage. She sat at the kitchen table and began to pull out their legal documents, her eyes scanning the fine print of the loan agreements Tom had signed. It was worse than she imagined. He hadn't just borrowed money. He'd used their life as collateral. And then she found it. The document for Emily's surgery fund. The money they'd spent years saving. The money that was supposed to give their daughter a chance at a normal life. Tom had signed it away to a mob syndicate as a good faith deposit. The betrayal was a physical pain, a sharp blade twisting in her gut. He had sacrificed their child's future to pay for his own failures. She felt a sob rise in her throat, but she choked it back. Crying wouldn't fix the ledger. Crying wouldn't stop Miller. She flipped to the final pages of the book she'd taken from the garage, her eyes catching a name she didn't recognize. The anonymous donor who had suddenly paid off their mortgage 3 months ago, the one Tom had claimed was a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was a transaction. The name was listed in the ledger under a special section, Retainer. The loan shark kingpin hadn't just lent them money, he'd bought them. He'd paid the mortgage to ensure that Tom stayed in line, to make sure the McCormick family was permanently indebted to the syndicate. They weren't just borrowers, they were property. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were trapped in a web that had been spinning around them for years, and she'd been too tired, too focused on the daily grind to see it. She looked out the window at the dark streets of Gary. The city felt different now. Not just a place of decay, but a vast, interconnected machine of exploitation. And she was just another gear being ground down. Sleep was impossible. She spent the night pacing the small living room, the floorboards creaking under her feet. Every shadow outside the window looked like Miller. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a threat. When the sun finally began to crawl over the horizon, casting a sickly gray light over the neighborhood, she saw it. A black sedan idling at the end of the block. It wasn't Miller's SUV, but it had the same predatory stillness. She watched as the local school bus pulled up to the corner. Emily ran out, her wild curls bouncing, her backpack swaying as she climbed the steps. The bus pulled away, its yellow paint a bright splash of color against the gray morning. And then the sedan moved. It didn't speed off. It followed the bus at a deliberate, agonizing distance. Lisa's heart stopped. They weren't just coming for her or Tom. They were going after the only thing that mattered. She grabbed her keys and ran for her car, her mind a blur of panic and protective instinct. She followed them, keeping several cars between her and the sedan, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The sedan followed the bus all the way to the elementary school, then lingered at the gate for a few minutes before slowly driving away. It was a warning, a clear, unmistakable message. We know where she is. We can touch her whenever we want. She drove home in a daze, the world around her feeling thin and brittle. When she walked through the front door, Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He looked like a man who'd already given up. "They followed the bus, Tom," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He looked up, his eyes red and hollow. "I know. They called me. Lisa, I lost the collection. $50,000. It's gone. They think I skimmed it. They think I'm trying to run." "Did you?" "No, I was jumped. 3 guys, masks. They took everything. But the sergeant, he don't believe me. He thinks I'm playing him." "The sergeant?" Lisa froze. "What sergeant, Tom?" "Reynolds, the neighborhood watch guy. He's the one who runs the collections for the kingpin. He's the muscle, Lisa. The law is the mob here. The world tilted on its axis. Sergeant Reynolds, the man who'd given Emily a sticker last week at the community fair, the man who'd promised to keep an eye on things for them. He was the one pulling the strings. The betrayal was complete. There was no one to turn to, no system to protect them. They were in the middle of a war zone, and the enemy was wearing a badge. "We have to give them the ledger," Tom whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the only thing they want. If we give it back, maybe they'll let us go." "No," Lisa said, the word sharp and final. "If we give it back, we have nothing. That book is the only leverage we have. We're not giving it back. We're going to use it." She spent the next hour making calls, trying to find a way out. She contacted an old friend from the factory, a man named Joe who had connections to the local unions. He suggested a neutral middleman, someone who could negotiate a truce between the McCormicks and the syndicate. Lisa didn't trust it, but she didn't have a choice. She arranged a meeting at an old industrial park on the edge of town, promising to bring the ledger in exchange for a guarantee of safety for Emily and Tom. She didn't tell Tom where she was going. She grabbed the ledger from the garage, shoved it into her tool bag, and headed for her car. But when she pressed the brake pedal to back out of the driveway, it went straight to the floor. No resistance, no stopping power. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pumped the pedal frantically, the car rolling slowly toward the street. She grabbed the emergency brake, the cable groaning as it brought the vehicle to a jerky halt. She sat in the driver's seat, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. They'd tampered with her car. They weren't waiting for a meeting. They were trying to kill her. She climbed out, her legs feeling like jelly, and looked under the chassis. The brake lines had been cleanly cut, the fluid dripping onto the driveway like oil-slicked blood. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't go to the meeting. She was trapped. She looked up at the street lights on her block. One by one, they were flickering and going out. Not a power failure. She could see the dark shapes of men moving through the shadows, systematically smashing the bulbs with long poles. Her house was being plunged into total darkness, the neighborhood being prepared for an assault. The isolation was absolute. She grabbed her tool bag and began to walk, staying in the shadows, her eyes scanning every alleyway and doorway. She needed a place to think, a place where people were, where they wouldn't dare attack her in the open. She found herself at the local diner, the neon "open" sign flickering a rhythmic, comforting pink. She slid into a back booth, her bag tucked under her feet. The diner was nearly empty. The only other customers, a couple of truckers at the counter and an old man nursing a cup of coffee. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and bright red hair, brought Lisa a cup of coffee without being asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey," the waitress said, her voice kind but weary. "Something like that," Lisa muttered, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the Formica tabletop. She'd only been there 10 minutes when the bell above the door chimed. 2 men walked in. They weren't wearing masks, but they didn't need to. They had the unmistakable look of professional violence. The heavy coats, the cold eyes, the way they scanned the room before focusing on Lisa. Miller's associates. They didn't say a word. They just walked over and slid into the booth across from her, their presence instantly turning the warm diner into a cage. "The book, Lisa," the one on the left said. He had a jagged scar across his cheek and smelled of stale cigarettes. "Hand it over, and we can all go home." Lisa looked at the counter. A large, industrial-sized pot of coffee was sitting on the burner, the steam rising in a thick, fragrant cloud. She looked at the men, then at the waitress, who was watching from the kitchen pass-through, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't have it," Lisa said, her voice steady. The man on the right reached across the table, his hand closing around her wrist like a vice. "Don't lie to us, bitch. We know it's in the bag." Lisa didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy ceramic mug of scalding coffee in front of her and flung it into the face of the man holding her. He let out a primal scream, his hands flying to his eyes as the boiling liquid seared his skin. In the same motion, she lunged for the counter, grabbing the entire pot of coffee and swinging it in a wide arc. The second man tried to duck, but the heavy glass shattered against his shoulder, drenching him in boiling liquid and shards of glass. The diner erupted into chaos. The truckers shouted, the waitress screamed, and Lisa didn't wait to see the aftermath. She dove over the counter, her boots skidding on the greasy floor, and sprinted toward the kitchen. She knew the layout. She'd been here 100 times. She burst through the swinging doors, past the startled cook, and headed for the narrow service exit at the back. She burst out into the cool night air, her heart feeling like it was going to explode. She didn't stay on the main road. She ducked into a secluded alleyway, pressing her back against the cold brick wall, her breath hitching in her chest. She waited, her ears straining for the sound of pursuit. But all she heard was the distant wail of a siren and the hum of the city. She pulled the ledger out of her bag, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold it. She needed to know why this book was so important. Why were they willing to kill for it? She clicked on her high-powered flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness of the alley. She flipped to the back of the book, past the lists of names and the interest rates, to a section she hadn't looked at closely before. The handwriting changed. It wasn't Tom's cramped script anymore. It was a fluid, professional hand, the kind used by someone who spent their days signing official documents. She pulled a neighborhood watch flyer from her pocket, the one Sergeant Reynolds had given her, and compared the signatures. It was a perfect match. The ledger wasn't just a record of Tom's work. It was a record of the sergeant's corruption. He'd been using the loan shark operation to fund his own private empire, documenting every bribe, every payoff, every cent that flowed through the neighborhood. The book wasn't just leverage. It was a death warrant for the entire local police precinct. The realization was a cold, hard weight in her stomach. She wasn't just fighting a loan shark, she was fighting the law itself. And she was completely, utterly alone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she saw the image on the screen. It was a photo of Tom. He was tied to a chair in a dark, industrial space, his face beaten beyond recognition, a gag stuffed into his mouth. Below the photo was a single sentence. The midnight deadline has passed. The debt must be paid in blood. Lisa felt a wave of cold fury wash over her. They were going to kill him, not because of the money, but because he was a loose end. And she was next. She looked at her watch. 11:45 p.m. She had 15 minutes. She remembered something Tom had said once about insurance. She ran back to the garage, her mind racing. She searched through his welding gear, ignoring the tools and the scrap metal, until she found a small, inconspicuous pouch tucked into the lining of his heavy leather apron. Inside were 3 small, pulsing devices, GPS trackers. He hadn't been skimming the money. He'd been tracking the collectors. He'd been trying to build a case to find a way out of the web he'd spun for himself. He was a gambler and a liar, but he'd been trying to protect them in his own broken way. She activated the receiver, the small screen flickering to life. A single red dot was pulsing on a map of Gary. She zoomed in, her breath catching as she saw the location. The Gary steel mill. Her mill. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The place where she'd spent half her life, the place that was supposed to be her sanctuary, was the heart of the rot. The sergeant was using the mill's vast, empty spaces to run his operation, hidden in plain sight behind the facade of industry. She didn't call the police. She knew better now. She grabbed her tool bag, making sure her thermal cutting torch was fully charged, and headed for the mill. She used her employee keycard to enter through a side gate, the heavy metal door creaking on its hinges. The mill was a labyrinth of shadows and rusted machinery, the air thick with the scent of ozone and old grease. She saw the black sedans parked near the blast furnaces, their engines still warm, ticking in the quiet air. She moved like a shadow, her boots silent on the metal grates. She found a maintenance ladder and began to climb, her muscles screaming with the effort. She reached the overhead catwalks, 30 feet above the factory floor, and looked down. There they were, Sergeant Reynolds and Miller, standing over the broken form of her husband. The sergeant was holding a gun, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby furnace. He looked different now. Not the friendly neighborhood cop, but a predator who'd finally dropped the mask. "Where is it, Tom?" Reynolds' voice echoed through the cavernous space. "Where's the book?" Tom just groaned, a wet, rattling sound that made Lisa's heart ache. She shifted her weight, trying to get a better look, but her foot caught on a heavy wrench left behind by a maintenance crew. It clattered off the catwalk, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the mill. Reynolds and Miller spun around, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the shadows above. "Lisa," Reynolds called out, his voice deceptively calm. "I know you're up there. Come down and we can talk about this like adults." Lisa didn't answer. She moved quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs, using the labyrinth of steam pipes and iron supports to stay out of their line of sight. She knew this building better than they did. She'd welded every seam, walked every inch of these catwalks. She began to lead them away from Tom, making intentional noises, drawing them deeper into the heights of the mill. She reached a narrow gantry overlooking the main assembly floor. The sergeant was right behind her, his footsteps heavy on the metal plating. He cornered her at the end of the walkway, the only way out a 30-foot drop into the darkness below. "You're a hard woman to find, Lisa," Reynolds said, his breath coming in short bursts. "But it's over. Give me the ledger, and I'll let Tom go. I'll even give you enough money to get out of Gary." "Why, Reynolds?" Lisa asked, her voice a low growl. "Why do this to your own people?" The sergeant laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "My people? You think these losers are my people? Tom joined us years ago, Lisa. He didn't do it for the surgery fund. He did it to pay off a gambling debt he'd had since before you were married. He's been skimming from us for years, using you and the kid as an excuse." The betrayal was a physical blow, a sharp blade twisting in her gut. The heroic husband narrative was a lie. Tom hadn't been a victim of circumstance. He'd been a willing participant in the rot. He'd gambled away their lives before they'd even started. Lisa felt the last of her hope wither and die. She looked at the man she'd spent 15 years with, now just a broken shape on the floor below, and felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. She wasn't fighting for Tom anymore. She was fighting for herself. And for Emily. Miller joined Reynolds on the gantry, his face still red and blistered from the coffee. He was carrying a plastic jug of gasoline. Without a word, he began to splash the liquid onto the wooden platform, the acrid scent filling the air. "We're going to burn it all, Lisa," Reynolds said, pulling a lighter from his pocket. "The book, the mill, and you. A tragic industrial accident. The city will mourn for a week, and then they'll move on." Lisa reached into her tool belt and pulled out a flare gun she'd grabbed from an emergency station. She aimed it at the sergeant, her hand steady. "I don't think so, Reynolds." But before she could pull the trigger, a sudden burst of steam from a nearby valve obscured her vision. The hot, white cloud filling the narrow space. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He dropped the lighter. A wall of fire erupted on the gantry, the gasoline-soaked wood igniting with a roar. Lisa was trapped on a crane platform, the flames licking at her boots, the intense heat searing her skin. She stood at the edge of the drop, the ledger clutched in her hand, with no allies, no money, and no way down. The sergeant laughed from the other side of the fire, his face distorted by the shimmering heat. "Goodbye, Lisa. Give my regards to your mother." He began to pour more gasoline onto the only staircase leading down, the flames spreading with terrifying speed. Lisa didn't panic. She didn't scream. She looked at the structural pins of the adjacent gantry, the ones she'd welded herself 3 years ago. She knew exactly how much heat they could take. She pulled her portable thermal cutting torch from her belt and ignited it. The blue-white flame hissed into life, a familiar, comforting sound in the middle of the chaos. She didn't aim it at the men. She aimed it at the support pins. The steel began to glow, then melt, the precision flame cutting through the heavy metal like butter. The gantry groaned, the sound of protesting metal echoing through the mill. With a final, violent snap, the support gave way. The severed gantry swung downward, creating a makeshift ramp that bypassed the flaming stairs. Lisa didn't hesitate. She leapt onto the vibrating steel beam, sliding down the incline toward the lower assembly floor. She could feel the sergeant's hands reaching for her, his fingers brushing against her jacket. But she was already gone. She hit the ground level with a bone-jarring thud, the breath knocked out of her. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching for Tom. He was lying near the base of the furnace, still unconscious. She looked at him for a long moment, the man who had lied to her for 15 years. The man who had gambled away their daughter's future. She didn't help him. She couldn't. She turned and sprinted toward the mill's secure records room. She didn't need the physical ledger anymore. She needed the proof that would stick. She used her master keycard to enter the mill owner's private office. The air-conditioned stillness a shock after the heat of the fire. She sat at the main computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She compared the secret codes from the ledger to the mill's digital shipping manifests. It was all there. Millions of dollars being laundered through fake debts, the mill owner using the factory as a front for the sergeant's extortion ring. The entire corporate structure was a parasite, feeding on the very people who kept it running. She heard the sound of the office door being kicked in. Reynolds and Miller. They were covered in soot, their faces masks of fury. Lisa didn't look up. She hit the send button, uploading the ledger's digital evidence and the offshore account details to a secure federal whistleblower portal she'd found during her research. "It's done, Reynolds," she said, her voice calm and cold. "The feds have it all. Every name, every bribe, every cent." The sergeant roared in frustration, lunging across the desk. But Lisa was already moving. She smashed the heavy office window with a chair and climbed onto the external fire escape. As Reynolds burst through the door, she held up the physical ledger, the weathered leather book that had started it all. "You want it," she shouted, her voice echoing over the roar of the fire. "Go get it." She tossed the book into the massive smelting vat below, the molten steel swallowing it in a burst of white-hot sparks. The physical evidence was gone, melted into a featureless mass of metal. The sergeant watched it go, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated despair. Lisa reached the ground floor and stole a company truck, the engine roaring to life as she smashed through the perimeter fence. She didn't go to the local police station. She drove straight to the regional FBI field office in Chicago, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise over the lake, casting a pale, clean light over the city. She sat in a small, windowless room and told them everything. She gave them the digital keys, the GPS data, and the names of every person involved. She didn't ask for money. She asked for safety, witness protection, and a guarantee that Emily would get her surgery. She sat in the back of a federal vehicle an hour later, watching as a tactical team swarmed the Gary steel mill. She saw Reynolds, Miller, and the mill owner being led out in handcuffs, their faces pale in the morning light. The machine was being dismantled, one gear at a time. A federal prosecutor sat down next to her, his face weary but kind. "We've frozen the offshore accounts, Ms. McCormick. The money for your daughter's surgery, it's been recovered. We'll make sure she gets the best care." Lisa looked at her hands. The scars, the burns, the calluses, they were still there. But the trembling had stopped. "And Tom?" she asked. "He's in custody. He'll be facing a long time for his involvement." "I'm sorry, Lisa." She nodded. She wasn't sorry. She felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The lie was over. The debt was paid. She stood outside the closed factory gates, the air clear for the first time in years. The smell of ozone and burnt metal was gone, replaced by the scent of rain and damp earth. She looked at the skeletal remains of the mill, a monument to a past she was finally leaving behind. The foundation was broken, but for the first time, she could see the sky. She turned away from the gates and began to walk, her steps steady and sure, heading toward a future she'd finally built with her own two hands.